I probably should have just ignored that letter. 7 days to tear down a fence on my own land? Yeah, okay. But the way Verna Vance marched up my driveway like she owned the county, it didn't sit right. You ever had a neighbor like that? The kind who weaponizes rules but forgets boundaries? What started with a fence ended with me auctioning the land under her house. If your HOA's ever pulled something wild, drop it in the comments. You're watching QE Stories. I'm Harlan Thorne, and up until 6 months ago, I thought I was living the quiet life. I run a small landscape contracting business and train horses on my property. Nothing fancy, just honest work with my hands. My place sits at the end of Maple Grove Lane, a little neighborhood that's gotten way too big for its britches if you ask me. I've got about 5 acres, which around here makes me the guy with all that land. You know how people get about that. Most days, I'm perfectly happy to keep to myself, work with the horses, and let everyone else worry about their perfectly manicured lawns and matching mailboxes. Should have known that kind of peace couldn't last forever, especially not with someone like Verna Vance running the show. Looking back, maybe I should have trusted my gut more. There was always something about the way she stared at my fence, like she was measuring it for demolition. Verna showed up at my front door on a Tuesday morning in March, and I could tell from 50 yards away that this wasn't going to be a friendly visit. She's about 55, retired from some big-shot bank manager position, and she carries herself like she's still foreclosing on people's dreams for a living. The woman drives a white Lexus that she keeps so clean you'd think it was fresh off the showroom floor, and she was wearing one of those blazers that screams, "I demand to speak to your manager," from 3 blocks away. I was working on repairing a section of my stone fence when I saw her marching up my driveway with a clipboard. Never a good sign. I'm not even sure why I didn't just pretend I wasn't home, but something about her determined stride told me she wasn't going away until she'd said her piece. Looking back, I should have known right then that this woman was about to turn my peaceful little world upside down. "Mr. Thorne," she announced before she'd even reached me, like she was calling a board meeting to order. "I'm Verna Vance, president of the Maple Grove Homeowners Association, and we need to discuss your fence situation." She said fence situation the way most people would say sewage leak or tax audit. I straightened up from my work and took a good look at this woman who'd decided my fence was somehow her business. The fence in question is beautiful. Natural field stone that I'd built myself over the course of several weekends, maybe 4 feet high and running along the road edge of my property. It's the kind of craftsmanship that takes time and skill, something I was actually proud of. But standing there looking at Verna's expression, you'd have thought I'd built it out of old car parts and chicken wire. I couldn't help but wonder what kind of person looked at a well-built stone fence and saw a problem that needed solving. "That ugly rock wall," she continued, gesturing dramatically at my handiwork, "makes our beautiful neighborhood look like some abandoned farm. The HOA board has received multiple complaints about how it destroys the aesthetic continuity of our community." For a second, I thought she was joking. I blinked, looked at her face again. Nope. Dead serious. I'm not even sure why I didn't laugh out loud at that moment. Aesthetic continuity? We're talking about a neighborhood where half the houses have plastic flamingos in the front yard and the other half have those spinning flower things that looked like they came from a dollar store. But Verna was dead serious, standing there with her clipboard like she was about to serve me court papers. I just crossed my arms and waited for her to get to whatever point she was driving at, because something told me this conversation was about to get a whole lot more interesting. The way she kept glancing at her notes made it clear this wasn't a spontaneous visit. She'd planned this confrontation down to the last detail. "The board has voted," Verna announced with the kind of authority usually reserved for Supreme Court justices, "and we're giving you 7 days to voluntarily remove this eyesore. If you refuse to comply with community standards, we'll be forced to take more drastic measures." When I asked what exactly she meant by drastic measures, her smile turned into something that belonged in a shark documentary. "The HOA has full legal authority to force the auction of non-compliant properties, Mr. Thorne. We prefer not to go that route, but we will protect our community's property values by any means necessary." I almost asked her which rulebook gave her that power, but something in her tone made me pause. Either she was bluffing or she'd done this before. Did she really just threaten to auction off my property? Over a fence? On my own land? I had to stop and stare at her after that one, wondering if I'd somehow stumbled into an alternate reality where HOA presidents had the power to steal people's homes. The confidence in her voice suggested she'd done this dance before, and I found myself wondering how many other neighbors had folded under similar threats. I didn't argue with her, not yet anyway. Something about the whole situation felt off, like there was more to this story than a simple complaint about my fence. Instead, I just stood there with my arms crossed, watching her rant about property values and community standards, thinking to myself, "Lady, you just stepped in it." She kept talking for another 5 minutes, throwing around phrases like legal precedent and fiduciary responsibility, but all I could think about was how confident she seemed about her authority to auction off someone's property. That kind of confidence usually comes from experience, and I found myself wondering who else in the neighborhood had gotten the Verna Vance treatment over the years. Maybe I was being paranoid, but something about this whole encounter didn't add up. The way she avoided eye contact when she mentioned previous enforcement actions told me there was definitely more to this story. When Verna finally wrapped up her little speech, she handed me an official-looking letter with the HOA letterhead and a deadline circled in red ink. 7 days, Mr. Thorne. I hope you'll make the right decision for everyone involved. As I watched her walk back to that pristine Lexus, I couldn't shake the feeling that this woman had gotten way too comfortable throwing her weight around. I looked down at the letter in my hands, then back at my beautiful stone fence, and a slow smile started spreading across my face. "Are you absolutely sure everything the HOA has built is completely legal?" I called out to her retreating figure. Verna stopped dead in her tracks and turned around, looking startled for just a moment before quickly recovering her arrogant attitude. She didn't answer, just gave me a look that could have frozen hell over and climbed into her car. As I watched her drive away, I wondered if I should just tear down the fence and avoid the drama, or start digging, because something told me this fence was just the tip of a much bigger mess. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table with Verner's ultimatum letter, and a growing sense that something wasn't right about this whole situation. 7 days to tear down a fence on my own property, or face a forced auction. That seemed like an awful lot of power for a homeowners association to have, especially over someone who wasn't even technically in their neighborhood. My property sits at the end of the street, but I'd never been clear on whether I was actually part of their HOA. Was I even in the HOA? I wasn't sure. I'd never signed anything, but maybe they slipped something in small print. I needed answers. I'm not usually the type to dig through paperwork, but something about Verna's attitude had rubbed me the wrong way. She'd been so confident, so sure of her authority, like she'd done this dance before. I found myself wondering who else might have gotten steamrolled by her threats over the years, and whether anyone had ever bothered to check if she actually had the legal right to do what she was claiming. Maybe I was overthinking it, but her reaction to my question about legal construction had been telling. I spent the next few hours going through every document I had related to my property purchase. Deed, survey, title insurance, the works. I'm not exactly a legal expert, but I know how to read a property survey, and what I found in those dusty files made my blood run cold. According to the original survey from when I bought the place 8 years ago, my property line didn't end where I thought it did. In fact, it extended quite a bit further into what I'd always assumed was HOA common property. The strip of land along the neighborhood entrance where they'd built their fancy welcome sign, decorative landscaping, and those security cameras was actually mine, all of it. Every single stone, plant, and piece of hardware was sitting on property that legally belonged to me. My hand actually froze on the paper. For a second, I thought I'd read the lines wrong. I squinted, measured again, then sat back and just laughed, bitterly. I must have read that survey 3 times before it really sank in. The HOA had built their entire entrance display on my land without asking permission, without paying for it, without even acknowledging that it wasn't theirs to use. And they'd been doing it for 8 years, ever since I bought the place. While I was being the quiet neighbor who didn't make waves, they were basically squatting on my property, and now threatening to auction off my house over a fence that was completely legal. The hypocrisy was so thick you could shovel it. Verna wanted my land cleared, while squatting on it herself for 8 years. Looking back, I should have been angrier in that moment, but mostly I was just amazed at the sheer audacity of it all. This woman had been lecturing me about property rights while violating mine for 8 straight years. I grabbed a flashlight and walked down to the property line to see exactly what we were talking about. The HOA's entrance features were impressive. I'll give them that. A massive stone sign reading Maple Grove Estates, professional landscaping with seasonal flowers, decorative lighting, and a couple of security cameras pointed at the street. It probably cost them $15,000 or $20,000 to build, and it definitely improved the neighborhood's curb appeal. But according to my survey, every bit of it was sitting 15 feet onto my property. 15 feet. That's not a simple surveying error or a boundary dispute. That's a significant chunk of land that they'd been using like they owned it. I stood there in the dark, looking at their fancy sign illuminated by spotlights that were plugged into my electrical grid, wondering how many others she'd steamrolled, buried under HOA letters and fake legalese. The more I stared at that expensive entrance display sitting on my land, the angrier I got. The more I thought about it, the more questions I had. Had they done this to other neighbors? Was this whole HOA thing just Verna's personal empire built on intimidation and property theft? I wasn't sure if I was overreacting or if I'd stumbled onto something bigger, but one thing was clear. This woman had picked the wrong guy to mess with. Instead of calling her immediately and demanding an explanation, I decided to let her dig herself a little deeper. If Verna wanted to play property games, I was going to make sure I had all my ducks in a row before I showed my hand. The smart move was to get everything officially documented before she realized what kind of position she'd put herself in. I also started thinking about what other corners the HOA might have cut under her leadership. If they were this careless with property lines, what else had they done wrong? The next morning, I called a professional surveyor, not the guy who'd done the original work, but someone completely independent who could verify what I was seeing. I also started taking photographs of everything, the sign, the landscaping, the cameras, all of it sitting pretty on property that belonged to me. Part of me felt like I was being petty, but then I remembered Verna's threat to auction off my home, and any guilt disappeared real quick. She'd opened this can of worms with her 7-day ultimatum, and her talk about protecting property values by any means necessary. Well, now she was going to find out what property protection really looked like when you messed with someone who actually knew their rights. I also started keeping a detailed log of every interaction, every threat, every claim she'd made about the HOA's authority. I sat back in my chair that night, looking at all the evidence spread out across my kitchen table, and a slow smile started spreading across my face. You want to play property games, Verna? Game on. But as I stared at those property lines and thought about what this discovery could mean, a darker thought crept into my mind. If the HOA had been this careless with my property, what other corners had they cut? What other rules had they bent or broken while building their little kingdom? Maybe I was about to uncover just the tip of the iceberg, and honestly, I wasn't sure if I was ready for what else I might find. All I knew was that Verna's 7-day deadline was starting to look less like a threat and more like the countdown to her own reckoning. What if this discovery was just the tip of the iceberg? 4 days later, she fired the first official volley. Certified letter. Legalese thicker than peanut butter. I found a certified letter in my mailbox that looked like it had been drafted by a team of lawyers who charged by the word. The thing was 3 pages long and full of legal jargon that basically boiled down to, tear down your fence or we'll take your house. But here's the kicker. Attached to this official threat was a notice for a community meeting scheduled for the following Saturday to discuss my ongoing property violations and their impact on neighborhood standards. She was actually organizing a public trial for me, complete with neighbors as the jury. I actually had to reread the letter. A public meeting over a 4-foot fence? She wanted me on trial in front of my neighbors like I was a criminal. I had to admire the woman's commitment to drama, even if her legal authority was about as solid as a house of cards in a hurricane. The fact that she was this confident about her position made me wonder how many other neighbors had been intimidated by similar tactics. The meeting was set for 7 p.m. at the community center, and according to the notice, it was specifically to address the non-compliant stone fence construction that violates established aesthetic guidelines and threatens property values throughout Maple Grove Estates. Reading that, I couldn't help but laugh. Here was Verna, scheduling a public meeting to shame me over a fence on my own property, while she was sitting on 8 years of trespassing and unauthorized construction on my land. The woman either had nerves of steel or absolutely no idea what kind of legal trouble she was walking into. Maybe both. Part of me wondered if I should just show up with my survey and end this whole charade right then and there, but something told me to let her keep digging this hole a little deeper first. I was curious to see how far she'd go with her threats before reality caught up with her. Saturday evening rolled around and I showed up to find the community center more packed than I'd ever seen it. Maybe 20 or 25 neighbors had turned out for what Verna was clearly billing as the trial of the century. She'd set up a presentation area with a projector and everything, like this was some kind of corporate board meeting instead of a neighborhood dispute over a stone fence. I took a seat in the back and watched her work the room, greeting people like she was running for mayor. The woman knew how to command an audience, I'll give her that. She had photos printed out, charts showing property values, even a PowerPoint presentation about maintaining community standards. She even had animations. I half expected the next slide to accuse me of single-handedly lowering Zillow estimates. All of this for a 4-foot stone fence that wasn't bothering anyone except her. Watching her preparation, I realized this wasn't just about my fence. This was about establishing dominance and sending a message to the entire neighborhood. When Verna called the meeting to order, she launched into what can only be described as a prosecution speech. Ladies and gentlemen, we're here tonight because one resident's refusal to follow community guidelines threatens everything we've worked to build in Maple Grove Estates. She clicked through photos of my fence taken from various angles, some of which made it look more imposing than it actually was. This unauthorized stone barrier destroys the visual flow of our neighborhood and sets a dangerous precedent for other residents to ignore established standards. Seriously? Did she really just call my fence an unauthorized stone barrier? I wasn't sure if I should be offended or impressed by her creative use of language. The way she presented it, you'd think I'd built the Berlin Wall in the middle of suburbia. The presentation went on for about 15 minutes, with Verna painting me as some kind of rogue property owner who was single-handedly destroying the neighborhood's property values. She had testimonials from neighbors complaining about the fence's impact on the overall aesthetic experience of driving through Maple Grove Estates. A few people even spoke up during the meeting, mostly echoing Verna's talking points about community standards and property values. Let her dig. Every slide, every fake rule she quoted, I was just collecting ammunition. Every threat she made, every claim about the HOA's authority to enforce property standards, just made what was coming next that much sweeter. I could see a few neighbors shooting me sympathetic looks, but most seemed to be buying into Verna's narrative about protecting their investments. But the real moment of truth came when a neighbor from down the street asked the question I'd been waiting for. Verna, are you absolutely certain the HOA has the legal authority to force property auctions? That seems like an extreme measure for a fence dispute. Verna's response was perfect. She practically puffed up with authority as she declared, absolutely, the Maple Grove HOA has full legal authority to maintain community standards by whatever means necessary, including forced auctions of non-compliant properties. We've used this authority before, and we won't hesitate to use it again to protect our community's interests. That sentence? That's the one that did it. Right there, she just handed me the rope and she didn't even notice. I actually had to bite my lip to keep from laughing out loud at that one. She'd just announced to a room full of witnesses that she'd forced other people out of their homes and was planning to do it to me too. The casual way she mentioned previous enforcement actions told me everything I needed to know about her leadership style. While Verna was up there making threats and throwing around legal terms like confetti, I was quietly documenting everything in my notebook. Every claim about the HOA's authority, every threat about forced auctions, every statement about their previous enforcement actions. This woman was building my legal case for me, one arrogant declaration at a time. When the meeting finally wound down and people started filing out, a few neighbors approached me privately. Is it true? They can really auction off your property. Have they done this to other people? What are you going to do? I just smiled and told them we'd have to wait and see how it all played out. I could see the worry in their eyes. If Verna could threaten me over a legal fence, what might she do to them over smaller violations? After most of the crowd had left, Verna approached me with that same shark smile she'd worn at my fence. I hope tonight helped clarify the situation for you, Harlan. This isn't personal, it's just business. But rules are rules, and we have a responsibility to enforce them. I looked her right in the eye and said, I completely agree, Verna. Rules are definitely rules, and everyone should be held to the same standard. Something in my tone must have registered with her because she paused for just a moment, like she was trying to figure out if there was a hidden meaning in my words, but then she just nodded and walked away, probably thinking she'd won some kind of victory. As I walked to my truck, I found myself wondering if I was being too patient with this whole situation or if I was setting up the perfect trap. The professional surveyor showed up at 8 a.m. sharp on Thursday morning, 2 days before Verna's ultimatum was set to expire. I'd hired Peterson & Associates, a firm that's been doing property surveys in our county for over 30 years, specifically because I wanted someone with an unshakable reputation for accuracy. When Tom Peterson stepped out with his crew and the kind of gear that makes lawyers nervous, I knew this was about to get serious. The man's been in the business since before GPS was a thing, and if he said something was on my property, you could take that to the bank. I explained the situation to him, the HOA threats, the fence dispute, and my suspicions about their entrance features, and his reaction was exactly what I'd hoped for. "Let's see what we're really dealing with here," he said, with the kind of professional calm that comes from decades of settling property disputes. His crew started setting up their equipment while I explained the timeline and stakes involved. It took them about 3 hours to do a complete survey of my property lines, using both GPS equipment and traditional surveying methods to make absolutely sure their measurements were accurate. I watched them work, setting up their instruments and taking readings, occasionally conferring over their tablets and maps. You could tell these guys knew their business. Every measurement was double-checked, every marker was placed with precision. When they finally finished and called me over to see the results, Tom Peterson's expression told me everything I needed to know before he even opened his mouth. "Mr. Thorne," he said, pointing to the bright orange stakes they'd placed along my actual property line, "I've got some news that's going to complicate your neighbor's situation significantly." The way he said it, with that mix of professional concern and barely contained amazement, told me the results were even better than I'd hoped. This wasn't about fences anymore. This was a full-on legal minefield, and I was ready to walk right through it. The official results were even better than I'd hoped. According to Peterson's survey, the HOA entrance sign was sitting 12 feet onto my property. The decorative landscaping extended 15 feet past the actual property line. Those security cameras that had been watching the neighborhood for years, 8 feet onto my land. The stone entrance pillars that probably cost them $5,000 each, 10 feet into my territory. Every piece of Maple Grove's grand entrance, the sign, the lights, the plants, was illegally squatting on my land, and now I had the documentation to prove it. Tom handed me a detailed report with measurements, photographs, and GPS coordinates that would hold up in any court in the country. Looking at those numbers, I couldn't help but wonder how the HOA had managed to get this so wrong for so many years. "In 30 years of doing this," Tom said, shaking his head, "I've never seen a property line violation this extensive." Word about the survey spread through the neighborhood faster than gossip at a church picnic. By Thursday afternoon, my phone was ringing off the hook with neighbors wanting to know what was going on. Some were genuinely curious. "Harlan, is it true the HOA built on your land?" Others seemed worried about what this might mean for their own properties. "If they got your property lines wrong, what about ours?" A few people even stopped by in person, wanting to see the survey markers for themselves. One neighbor from Cedar Drive actually brought her own measuring tape to verify the distances, like she couldn't quite believe what she was hearing. I welcomed the attention. More eyes meant more proof, and Verna was about to learn that secrets don't like daylight. The fact that so many neighbors were suddenly questioning the HOA's competence told me Verna's iron grip on the community was starting to slip. But the real fireworks started when word got back to Verna about the survey. She called me Thursday evening, and for the first time since this whole mess started, her voice didn't have that confident, in-control tone she usually carried. "Harlan," she said, trying to sound casual, "I heard some ridiculous rumors about property lines and survey stakes. You know those old surveys can be off, especially with larger lots like yours, right?" There was something almost desperate in the way she said it, like she was hoping I'd agree that the whole thing was just a big misunderstanding. When I told her I'd had the property professionally surveyed by Peterson and Associates, the silence on the other end of the line lasted so long I thought she'd hung up. "We should probably talk," I said, and she agreed to come by in the morning. Her voice wasn't as steady this time. The shakiness in her voice told me she was finally starting to understand the magnitude of her problem. Friday morning, Verna showed up at my property looking like she hadn't slept much the night before. Gone was the confident HOA president who'd threatened to auction off my house. This was a woman who was starting to realize she might be in serious trouble. I walked her along the property line, showing her each survey marker and explaining exactly what they meant. When we got to the entrance sign and I pointed out that it was sitting 12 feet onto my property, her face went white. "This is just a technicality," she said, but her voice was shaky. "We can work something out. Maybe we can pay you some small fee for the use of the land, make it all official and proper." The woman who'd been threatening forced auctions just a week ago was now trying to negotiate a rental agreement for property she'd been stealing from me for 8 years. I could see the wheels turning in her head as she tried to calculate how much this was going to cost the HOA. I looked at Verna standing there next to her fancy entrance sign, probably trying to calculate how much this was going to cost the HOA, and I decided it was time to lay my cards on the table. "Verna," I said, keeping my voice calm and reasonable, "just last week you threatened to auction off my property over a fence that's completely legal and sits entirely on my own land. Now I find out you've been building on my property without permission for 8 years. How exactly do you think this looks?" She tried to minimize it, talking about honest mistakes and how these things happen with older properties, but I could see in her eyes that she knew exactly how bad this was. When she finally left that morning, walking back to her Lexus like she was carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders, I knew the tables had completely turned. The question now wasn't whether I could keep my fence. It was what I was going to do about 8 years of unauthorized use of my property, and whether Verna was going to face any real consequences for her threats and intimidation tactics. You know what you do in my position? Take the small settlement and move on? Or make sure she learns a real lesson about respecting other people's property? As I watched her drive away, I realized I was about to become either the neighborhood hero who stood up to a bully or the guy who went too far for revenge. Am I about to become the very thing I hate? That Friday night, I sat down at my computer and wrote what I can only describe as the most satisfying email of my entire life. I'd gotten the contact list for the entire Maple Grove neighborhood from the HOA website. Ironically, Verna had made it public in the name of community transparency, and I was about to give everyone a transparency lesson they'd never forget. Time to teach this neighborhood what real transparency looks like and who's been hiding what. The subject line was simple: important property line information for all Maple Grove residents. I kept the tone professional but direct, laying out exactly what the survey had revealed and what it meant for the neighborhood. This wasn't about revenge, I told myself as I typed. This was about setting the record straight and making sure everyone understood what had really been going on under Verna's leadership. But let's be honest, there was definitely some satisfaction in knowing that Verna was about to get a taste of her own medicine. The email started with a brief explanation of the fence dispute and Verna's threats to auction my property, then moved into the survey results. I attached photos of the survey markers, copies of the official measurements, and a breakdown of exactly which HOA structures were built on my land. But here's where it got interesting. I also announced my intention to hold my own property auction, since Mrs. Vance seems to believe that property auctions are an appropriate way to resolve community disputes, I wrote. I've decided to auction off the land rights where her house sits. If auctions are fair game, then so is mine, just playing by her rules. I knew that would get people's attention, but what I really wanted was for everyone to understand that the person who'd been threatening their neighbor's home had been stealing from that same neighbor for 8 years. Looking back, I realized this is exactly the kind of story that people love, when the bully finally meets their match and gets a taste of their own medicine. But living through it, that's a whole different experience. I hit send at 10 p.m. on Friday night, and then sat back to wait for the fireworks. I didn't have to wait long. My phone started ringing within minutes. Apparently, people check their email even on Friday nights, when there's neighborhood drama involved. The first few calls were from neighbors who wanted to make sure they'd read the email correctly. "Harlan, did you really say Verna's house is partially on your property? Are you actually going to auction off her lot? Is this some kind of joke?" I patiently explained the situation to each caller, walking them through the survey results and the legal implications of what the HOA had been doing. By midnight, I'd taken about 15 calls, each one part disbelief, part outrage, and a dash of gossip. Most people said the same thing. "She really tried to auction your place while she was on your land?" The most common reaction was pure amazement at the hypocrisy of the whole situation. Saturday morning brought a whole new wave of reactions. Some neighbors were firmly in my corner. "Good for you, Harlan. She had it coming." Others were worried about what this meant for the neighborhood. "This is getting out of hand. Can't we just work something out quietly?" But the most interesting responses came from people who started sharing their own stories about Verna's management style. Apparently, I wasn't the first person she'd threatened with property action. A neighbor from Oak Street told me about the time Verna had demanded she remove a vegetable garden from her backyard because it was inconsistent with neighborhood aesthetics. Someone from Pine Avenue had been forced to repaint his entire house because Verna decided his color choice was too bold for community standards. The more stories I heard, the clearer it became that my fence was just the latest target in a pattern of intimidation and control that had been going on for years. But the call I'd been waiting for came around noon. Verna, and she was absolutely livid. "You can't do this," she screamed into the phone. "This is harassment. This is extortion. I'll sue you for everything you're worth." I let her rant for a few minutes before calmly responding. "Verna, I'm just following your example. You taught me how property auctions work, remember? You said they were an appropriate way to handle community disputes." The silence that followed was so complete I thought she might have had a stroke. When she finally spoke again, her voice was different, smaller, more desperate. "Harlan, please. We can fix this. My grandkids come to that house. It's not just bricks to me." For a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. But then I remembered her threatening to auction my house, and any sympathy disappeared. This was about making sure she understood what it felt like to have someone threaten everything you'd worked for. The neighborhood was buzzing all weekend. People were choosing sides, with Team Harlan gaining ground as more stories about Verna's authoritarian leadership came to light. The fact that she'd been building on my property for 8 years while threatening to auction my house for a legal fence wasn't sitting well with a lot of folks. Even some of her supporters were starting to question whether she'd overstepped her authority. I spent most of Saturday fielding calls and visits from neighbors who wanted to understand exactly what was happening and what it meant for the community. Some were worried about their own property lines, others were concerned about the legal implications for the HOA, and a few were just excited to see someone finally stand up to Verna's bullying tactics. The general consensus seemed to be that Verna had been running the HOA like her personal kingdom for too long, and maybe it was time for some accountability. By Sunday evening, I'd made the official announcement. The auction would be held the following Saturday at 10 a.m. in the community center. "All are welcome," I wrote in a follow-up email. Might as well turn her drama into an open house. I kept the tone light, but the message was clear. This was happening, and it was happening soon. As I hit send on that final email, I felt a mixture of satisfaction and uncertainty. On one hand, justice was finally being served to someone who'd been abusing her power for years. On the other hand, I was about to become either the neighborhood hero or the neighborhood villain, and honestly, I wasn't sure which one it was going to be. All I knew was that Verna had started this fight with her threats and intimidation, and I planned to end it in a way that would make sure no one forgot who really owned the land. What if I've just declared war on my entire neighborhood? Saturday morning arrived, with the kind of crisp October air that makes everything feel electric, and I woke up knowing this was going to be a day that nobody in Maple Grove would ever forget. I'd hired a professional auctioneer, Jim Morrison, who'd been running estate sales and property auctions in our county for 20 years, and set up the whole thing properly in the community center. Word had spread beyond our neighborhood, and I'd started getting calls from people as far away as the next county who'd heard about the revenge auction and wanted to see how it played out. Hard to believe a fence fight had turned into the biggest suburban drama our town's seen in years. But mostly, I was just ready to see it through to the end. I'd even had a reporter from the local paper call asking for an interview, though I decided to let the auction speak for itself. The community center was packed by 9:45 a.m. I'd expected a good turnout from the neighborhood, but this was beyond anything I'd imagined. There were at least 60 people crammed into a space that usually held maybe 30 for HOA meetings, and I recognized maybe half of them as actual residents. The rest were curiosity seekers, potential investors, and what looked like a few more reporters who'd gotten wind of the story. The room buzzed like a courtroom before the verdict. People whispered like they didn't want to disturb the storm. Some nodded like I was their folk hero. Others stared like I'd brought a match to a gas station, and a few seemed genuinely afraid of what was about to happen. I spotted several people taking photos and videos, which told me this story was probably going to spread beyond our little neighborhood drama. Verna walked in at 9:55, face drawn, posture sagging, like someone who'd spent the night bargaining with ghosts. The woman who once barked orders now shuffled like a school principal facing the school board. This was a broken woman who was about to lose everything she'd worked for. She was alone, which surprised me a little. I'd expected her to bring a lawyer or at least some of her HOA board supporters, but she just sat by herself in the front row, staring at the podium where Jim Morrison was setting up his auction materials. When our eyes met across the room, I saw something I'd never seen from her before. Genuine fear. Not anger, not indignation, but the kind of fear that comes when you realize you've pushed someone too far and there's no way back. For a split second, I wondered if I was going too far, but then I remembered her threat to auction my house and any doubt disappeared. Jim Morrison called the auction to order at exactly 10 a.m., and the room went dead silent. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're here today to auction the land rights for Lot 27, Maple Grove Estates, currently occupied by the residents of Mrs. Verna Vance. The opening bid is $50,000 for exclusive land rights, with the understanding that any existing structures will need to negotiate new terms with the winning bidder." The words hung in the air like a death sentence, and I could see Verna physically shrink in her chair. A few people in the crowd shifted uncomfortably. Apparently, the reality of what was happening was starting to sink in for everyone, not just Verna. I noticed several neighbors looking between Verna and me, maybe wondering if this was justice or just a neighbor finally going nuclear. Before the bidding could begin, Verna suddenly stood up and turned to face the crowd. "This is wrong," she said, her voice cracking with emotion. "He's trying to steal my home. I made one mistake with the property lines, and now he's destroying my entire life." For a moment, the room was completely silent, and I could see some people wavering in their support. But then a neighbor from Oak Street stood up and said, "One mistake? Verna, you tried to sell his land out from under him over a fence that's fully legal." Other neighbors started chiming in with their own stories about Verna's authoritarian tactics, and pretty soon the crowd was buzzing with years of pent-up frustration about her leadership. "She forced me to repaint my entire house. She tried to make me remove my vegetable garden. She's been threatening people for years." The room erupted into a chorus of complaints that had been building up for years under Verna's iron-fisted rule. The bidding started slowly. Most of the neighbors were clearly uncomfortable with the whole situation, and the opening bid of $50,000 was a lot of money for a community dispute. But a few outside investors had shown up, and they started pushing the price higher. 60,000, 65, 70,000. Each bid brought Verna closer to tears and pushed the crowd's tension higher. I watched it all unfold from the back of the room, feeling a mixture of satisfaction and something that might have been regret. This woman had threatened my home and been stealing my property for years, but seeing her break down in front of the entire neighborhood was harder to watch than I'd expected. Some neighbors were clearly enjoying the spectacle, while others looked genuinely uncomfortable with how far this had gone. When the bidding reached $75,000, Verna tried desperately to bid herself, but it was clear she didn't have that kind of money available. She was crying openly now, begging neighbors to help her, promising to tear down everything on my property and step down as HOA president if I'd just call off the auction. The crowd was getting restless. Some people were clearly enjoying the spectacle, others looked genuinely uncomfortable with how far this had gone. Jim Morrison started his chant, going once, going twice, and suddenly everything froze in my chest. In about 10 seconds, Verna was going to lose her home, and I was going to be the guy who made it happen. Looking at her sitting there, completely broken, I had to ask myself, was I balancing the scales or just swinging the same hammer she once held? The auctioneer's gavel was about to fall, and I realized I had maybe 5 seconds to decide what kind of man I really wanted to be. If you were holding all the cards, would you show mercy or finish what they started? I'm either about to become the neighborhood hero or its biggest villain. Just as Jim Morrison raised his gavel for the final sold, I raised my hand and called out, "I bid $80,000. The entire room went dead silent. You could have heard a pin drop in that community center. Verna looked at me like I'd started speaking in tongues, equal parts confusion, disbelief, and something close to hope. Why would I bid on land rights I already owned? But I had a plan, and it was time to show everyone in that room what real leadership looked like. As the winning bidder, I now legally controlled the land under Verna's house, which meant I could do whatever I wanted with it. What I really wanted was to show that real justice doesn't always swing like a wrecking ball. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is show mercy when you have every right to seek revenge. I stood up and addressed the crowd, feeling every pair of eyes in the room focused on me. "I didn't want Verna to lose her home," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the silent room. "I wanted her to understand what it feels like to have someone threaten your property, your security, your life's work. Now that she does, we can rebuild, this time with actual foundations." I turned to look directly at Verna, who was still crying but watching me with something that might have been hope. "I'm prepared to offer you a reasonable lease agreement to stay in your home, Verna, but there are conditions." The crowd started murmuring. This wasn't the ending anyone had expected, including me until about 30 seconds ago. Their faces were a swirl of shock, relief, and the awkward silence of expectations being rewritten. "First," I continued, "you step down as HOA president immediately and permanently. Second, you help us create new community guidelines that actually serve the neighborhood instead of just giving you power to threaten people. And third, you pay fair compensation for the 8 years you've been using my property without permission." Verna nodded so vigorously I thought she might hurt her neck, tears still streaming down her face. "Yes," she breathed, then louder, "Yes, anything, just thank you." The relief in her voice was palpable. and I could see some of the tension leaving the room as people realized this story might actually have a happy ending. Several neighbors started applauding, apparently impressed by what they saw as an act of mercy and wisdom rather than petty revenge. The crowd erupted in a mixture of applause and surprised chatter. Some neighbors were clearly pleased with the resolution. They wanted to see Verna face consequences, but they hadn't really wanted to see her lose her home. Others seemed almost disappointed that there wouldn't be more drama. But mostly, people just seemed relieved that a neighborhood dispute that had gotten completely out of hand was finally being resolved in a way that didn't destroy anyone's life. A neighbor from Cedar Drive actually stood up and started clapping, and pretty soon most of the room was applauding what they apparently saw as an act of mercy and wisdom. Even some of the outside investors who'd been bidding seemed impressed by the unexpected resolution. Over the next few weeks, we worked together to completely restructure how the Maple Grove HOA operated. Gone were the threats and intimidation tactics that had defined Verna's leadership. Instead, we created transparent decision-making processes with public votes on all major issues. No more threatening property auctions over aesthetic complaints. No more one-person rule disguised as community standards. We established annual rotation of leadership positions, so no one person could accumulate the kind of power that had corrupted Verna's judgment. Most importantly, we required written consent from property owners before the HOA could build anything that might affect their land. Amazing how much better things work when you actually follow the law and treat people with respect instead of ruling through fear and intimidation. The property resolution turned out to be straightforward once lawyers got involved. The HOA agreed to remove all their structures from my land within 30 days and pay me $25,000 in compensation for 8 years of unauthorized use. My fence stayed exactly where it was, now officially recognized as completely legal and properly positioned on my own property. We established clear, recorded boundaries for everyone in the neighborhood and created new rules requiring written property owner consent before any community structures could be built. Amazing how much simpler things become when everyone agrees to follow basic property laws and treat each other like human beings instead of obstacles to their personal vision. The whole process took about 6 weeks, but by Thanksgiving, everything was officially resolved. 6 months later, our neighborhood had transformed completely. Property values actually increased because of our new transparent, fair management system. People started choosing to move to Maple Grove specifically because we had what one real estate agent called the fairest HOA in the county. No more fear-based compliance with arbitrary rules. No more neighbors afraid to speak up when they disagreed with community decisions. No more tyrants in blazers handing out ultimatums like parking tickets. We had real community events instead of mandatory meetings, where people got lectured about violations. And people actually enjoyed living here instead of just enduring it. The transformation was remarkable. Neighbors actually talk to each other now, instead of avoiding eye contact for fear of getting reported for some imaginary violation. Verna kept her word about everything. She stepped down as president, helped create the new guidelines, and paid her portion of the compensation without complaint. More surprisingly, she seemed genuinely happier without the stress of trying to control everyone around her. She started volunteering at the local animal shelter and actually became a decent neighbor once she wasn't drunk on power anymore. Sometimes I see her working in her garden and we'll wave to each other like normal people. It's amazing how much more pleasant someone can be when they're not constantly trying to prove their authority over everyone around them. One afternoon she even said, "Thank you for showing me who I used to be." Never thought I'd hear that. Looking back now, I'm sitting on my porch looking at that same stone fence that started this whole crazy adventure. It's still standing, still beautiful, still exactly where it belongs on my own property. My horses graze peacefully in the background, and neighbors actually wave when they walk by instead of scurrying past like they're afraid of getting reported for some imaginary violation. The fence that Verna called an unauthorized stone barrier has become something of a neighborhood landmark. People point it out to visitors as the fence that brought down a tyrant and created a better community. New residents specifically ask about the famous fence when they're looking at houses in our area. This whole mess showed me something I didn't expect. Sometimes the folks yelling the loudest are standing on the weakest ground. Verna's power, it wasn't real. It came from silence, from people too tired or too scared to push back. But once someone did, with facts, not fear, it all collapsed. And yeah, I could have crushed her, legally, publicly, but maybe justice isn't about breaking people. Maybe it's about holding the line. then offering a way back. If this story hit something in you, hit like or leave a comment. It helps more than you know. And if you want to support the channel, there's that little thanks button below. No pressure. This is QA Stories, and I'll see y'all next time.
Appreciate you sticking with us at QA Stories. Hit that bell so you never miss a moment, because things only get crazier from here.